everyone. Welcome back to After the Trial of Your Faith. I'm your host, Luke Banner. Thank you all so much again for taking the time to listen to this episode. I'm really excited for this one, as I've been sharing the story of how I gained my testimony and the different ideas and experiences that have shaped it. I spent a lot of time focusing on the beginning of my mission. That time period was definitely the most drastic shift that I experienced in my relationship with God and understanding of the gospel, but I've known since the start of this podcast that I've wanted to reflect not just on those early experiences, but also the other 22 months. I wanted to see how they shaped my testimony beyond what I was beginning to feel from those early experiences, because the truth is my mission was not just a continual increase in my testimony and spirituality. There continued to be many ups and downs. And I had several points throughout my mission where I would say that I wasn't certain about my testimony at all. I had taken a massive first step into understanding what it meant to have faith in God, but that was only the beginning of what has become a lifetime of developing a relationship with God. I wanted to start to delve deeper into what came after I began to make the transition to exercising faith. I want to outline some of the moments that continued to shape me, the highs and the lows that I endured, and later on, what made the difference for me in those difficult moments. Today, I will focus on one of those first difficult experiences. Right after the first couple of months of my mission, after I exercised my faith to make the sacrifices that I needed to make, I expected everything to become a lot more simple. I was no longer fighting this massive, overpowering longing for home. I had made the decision that I was going to truly try to serve a mission as all in as I could. I'd learned so much through that experience. I had exercised my faith on something really difficult for me, and the relief and joy that I felt were incredible. I wanted to believe that this experience meant that I would continue to feel this spirit for the rest of my mission and life thereafter. But more than any of that, I expected this entire experience to solidify my testimony. I had what I believed in that moment was clear, unmistakable proof of God looking out for me and giving me the answer that I needed. I had tried to do it my way, failed over and over, and then finally felt like I'd heard his voice, even just a little bit, telling me that I did what I needed to do in order to learn. How could I possibly deny the massive difference that I felt? I had finally understood the gospel and learned to exercise my faith. I did it. That was it, right there. That was my testimony, right? I'm good now. I think everybody on their faith journey encounters some moment like this where you realize that what you thought would be your undeniable spiritual foundation turns out to be a lot easier to rationalize away and doubt than you first thought. I'm an overthinker. It's in my nature. It's really difficult for me to turn my brain off. Without the normal coping mechanisms or other things I would typically use to give my brain a distraction, like YouTube, video games, or sports, it gave me a lot of time to churn over what I was experiencing on my mission. Just by the nature of the mission, turning the church and the gospel into the defining characteristic of your life like it does, I thought about where I stood endlessly. I realized pretty quickly that my initial assumptions of what this moment would mean for my testimony could not have been further from the truth. Yet again, my understanding needed to mature. I'd absolutely made progress, that much was assured. I was no longer stuck in the survival mode that I'd been in throughout the first 2 months of my mission. I was finally able to breathe. But what that meant for me was that I now had the mental bandwidth to really examine where I stood in terms of my testimony. I was now able to really begin diving into what I believed and why I believed it. And I was able to do so from a healthier perspective. I went from just trying to survive, constantly gasping for air, to knowing that I needed to figure out the point of all of this, to see if it was something that I could believe in or not. I mentioned in my first episode, my homecoming talk, that bearing my testimony at many different points in my mission felt hollow. I would hear companions or members sharing their conversion stories, their aha moments that solidified the existence of God beyond a shadow of a doubt in their minds and hearts. I had hoped that my experience making my sacrifice would give a testimony of all of that, but the truth was it didn't. It didn't take long for the doubts that had plagued me and influenced how I distanced myself emotionally and spiritually to come crawling back. Questions like, what if that was just me figuring out what I needed to do myself? What if the people helping me were just giving me generic advice without God? This answer wasn't that complicated. We all could have figured it out. Did I only do this because I didn't have another choice? Because it was either do this or go home? Why should I assume that any of this is inspired? Thoughts and doubts like this slowly came back into my mind. My knowledge of God after this was still anything but certain. I had many doubts that remained unresolved, and I saw nothing that would firmly convince me in either direction for a long time. When it came time for me to bear testimony, I really didn't feel like I could actually say that I knew God or Christ lived. I felt like I would either try to and just feel my lack of true conviction as I spoke, or I would just sidestep it as much as I could. It sucked. I felt unbelievably inadequate being a missionary for God that was so unsure of his own faith. I'm going out and asking people to change their religion, to give up so much, for something that I myself was incredibly uncertain about. It seemed insanely hypocritical, and it was something I had to fight hard to overcome. The true feeling, the spiritual power, just wasn't always present, and I felt my lack of testimony many, many times holding me back in my ability as a missionary. The doubts just continued to claw at me. I tried to make up for my lack of real, certain testimony, and in a time of panic and uncertainty like I was in, I found myself falling back on what had been a strength of mine my entire life: knowledge. Being immersed in the gospel culture like I was, it didn't take long for me to get a really good grasp of the lessons, scriptures, and promised blessings that were supposed to come from the things I was teaching. I was picking up everything very fast, and I realized quickly that it gave me some level of supposed acceptance and even respect among other missionaries or members. It was this feeling that I desperately needed, as I felt what seemed like a lack of approval or recognition from God, and it came because of my encyclopedic knowledge. So seeing this, I decided that my best course of action would be to lean into that strength. I had the capacity to learn a lot of facts and other encyclopedic knowledge about missionary topics in the church as a whole, and I wanted to utilize that capacity as best as I possibly could. I justified leaning into this so heavily, even at the expense of trying to grow my connection with God, by telling myself that I wanted to be able to answer any questions that somebody might pose about our church. I wanted to know how I could address legitimate hang-ups people might have and help them understand these issues better. But as I've reflected, I've realized that this was only the surface of what I was trying to do. Without a developed testimony that I could share with any sort of real power or feeling, I instead wanted to be able to take a logical route and make a convincing argument as to why people should believe in and join the church. Knowing myself, I figured that the best route for me to go down would be trying to actually figure out what questions were out there. Why people chose not to believe in God or the church specifically, and also see the LDS responses to these arguments. Along with that, there was a large part of me that was searching for a rational justification for why I myself was spending 2 years of my time out here, outside of just because it's what I'm supposed to do. I was wondering why I was still doubting, and wanted to really dig into the arguments for and against believing in the church. Really, I was trying to justify why I was a member of the church at all, and why I was telling other people that they could and should do the same. So I decided that I wanted to spend my mission consuming as much information as I could, in order to rule out any possible alternative to the church, convince others of the flawless arguments I created in favor of the church, and hope that doing so would grant me a testimony along the way. Yes, I now sit here and recognize the contradiction of trying to gain something that only comes by exercising faith, by taking faith completely out of the equation. But at the time, I saw this as my only method of reconciliation. So I began studying, and studying, and studying. I breezed through the Book of Mormon early on, picking up many scriptures that I wanted to use later, but I also began researching other books outside of the scriptures or Preach My Gospel pretty quickly. I started a little more focused in the Gospel Library, inspired by early Bible bashes, which I saw as my first taste of arguments against the church that I would face throughout the next 2 years. I began perusing the Gospel Library for answers to common bashing questions, and stumbled across some old Ensign articles that directly addressed several of these issues. Things like if we are saved by grace or works, an explanation for Christ saying there is no marriage in the resurrection, or even something simple like addressing the Revelation scripture about adding to the Bible. There were a lot of these questions and answers there, and I found them fun and helpful for me to get my first taste of what became my focus of study, LDS apologetics. I think at this time it would be fair for me to explain a little bit more about what apologetics is. Apologetics means a reasoned, logical defense of your faith. It is no secret that a lot of our claims on their face are pretty out there, even among other religions. It's relying not so much on testimony, but on historical and logical argument and evidence to defend those claims. Throughout our church's history, we have constantly had to defend our beliefs against relentless attacks, both against our church specifically, as well as against Christianity and religion overall. Many leaders and scholars of the church throughout our history have taken the mantle of defending our beliefs. It was this field that captured my attention so completely on my mission. I did mock trial in high school, which is basically a courtroom-flavored debate team, and did quite well as a lawyer. In spite of my non-confrontational nature, there's a huge part of me that enjoys the challenge of finding ways to prove or disprove arguments. I saw apologetics as a perfect way to learn how to do exactly what I was trying to do: substitute faith with reason. So I began to really delve into it. It did not take long, however, before I realized just how limited I would be in my learning of LDS apologetics if I could only read the materials available to me in the Gospel Library. There was a lot there, but hardly any of it covered the apologetic topics I was looking for in depth. Believe it or not, most things in the Gospel Library focus more on spiritual experiences. That material felt like something that I couldn't properly replicate for an argument, so I largely ignored it, and instead decided that if approved sources were failing me in my quest to be a successful missionary through reason, I would just have to broaden my horizons. When you're a missionary, there's typically standards for approved mission reading. It's a little different per mission, but for us, our study was supposed to be contained to the Gospel Library. But during my mission, I did a ton of reading outside of that. I can call it like it is. It was a rule that I just didn't see a need to follow. I didn't have the faith to sacrifice the other reading material I began picking up. I couldn't see how it was hamstringing my spiritual development because all I saw was how it was helping me feel more certain about my beliefs and become a better missionary. It is amazing how hard-headed I was about this. In spite of my experience that I'd literally just had, learning how to trust God and exercise faith, to do what God asked me to do despite not understanding why, it was clear that I had not yet internalized this process at all. I was determined to strike out on my own and ignore the advice of every church leader ever. I decided that in order to be a successful missionary, instead of learning how to cultivate a relationship with the Spirit, I needed to learn how to teach without it. So where did young Elder Banner turn in his quest to prove that the church was true? Well, my dear listeners, how about the big kahuna of them all, the CES letter? That's right, I was not even out of training before I first heard tell of the mother of all anti-LDS arguments and decided that I was ready to tackle it. I didn't know much about it before my mission, but I had heard all about it before long. This was it. This was the document anti-Mormons would always point to and base their arguments off of. 130 plus pages of pure, unadulterated anti, bringing up every argument under the sun, and I wanted to learn everything it said so I could know exactly how to defend against it. Thankfully, I did not start by just reading the thing raw. A fellow missionary on a Google Drive had access to LDS scholar Jim Bennett's wonderful work, A Faithful Reply to the CES Letter, which contained the entire text of the CES letter, but with heavy, heavy LDS commentary. Bennett went through every argument and piece of evidence posed in the CES letter and provided some amazing and incredibly entertaining counters to everything it was throwing at us. He could turn something that seemed devastating to the church into something a lot less intimidating. Sometimes he would provide evidence directly contradicting the arguments being made in the CES letter. Sometimes he would attack the evidence used in the letter, recontextualizing it, or even just calling it out for its gross exaggeration or incredibly misleading presentation, drawing upon the years of LDS apologetic work to show how these issues had been disproven many times over. This was the perfect document for what I was trying to do. It broke down everything and gave me what felt like an arsenal of counterarguments that would be more than enough. This was my first real exposure to the arguments of the LDS debate, and I was looking for reasons to believe, desperately, so this was the exact lifeline that I thought I needed. In that desperation to feel validated, to rationalize my decision to be here on a mission, I saw this document as everything I could possibly need intellectually as well as spiritually. I poured into reading this document. I would read it over and over. It took up my personal study. I would read it during lunch or after we came home for the day, and I made it my goal to commit these arguments brought up by Bennett to memory. I truly thought that this would be the difference in my missionary work. I was ready to destroy any argument anybody could ever make against the church because everything I'd ever need to hear was right here in front of me. The entire corpus of anti-LDS in my eyes had just been destroyed, and I felt incredibly confident in my newfound knowledge. As an example of this, in my training we met a wonderful lady named Marcella. Her husband used to be RLDS, but now he was atheist. Marcella, however, was open to religion and agreed to hear us missionaries out. She had questions about the church based around what her husband had told her, and a big hang-up that she struggled with was polygamy. We sent her the church's essay on polygamy, and she typed out a long response to it outlining some problems she had. I remember, even after only a couple of months in the field, not feeling fazed at all by what appeared like an intimidating document. I was able to compose a response to her, and I felt like I could address everything she was saying confidently. That was a huge boost to my confidence. This initial euphoria stuck with me for a time. However, in spite of the occasional moments like I had with Marcella, it didn't take long for me to realize that my supposed altruistic reasoning for neglecting study of the Book of Mormon and Preach My Gospel, which, again, was to be prepared to answer questions of people who wanted to learn more about the church, was not coming to pass. The amount of time I spent dedicated to researching anti and the arguments against it was vastly disproportionate to the amount of time I spent actually using that knowledge. I recognized even early on that this was really just for myself, letting my own anxiety about not having a response ready to some argument and my own desire for rationalization of my decisions up to this point outweigh what I needed to actually be learning. But here's the thing, in spite of my recognition of this disconnect, I didn't let it stop me, because I had become so fixated on this field of apologetic study. I felt the best about my belief in the gospel that I had in a long, long time. Of course, some of it was that experience from the beginning of my mission. I was beginning to have some application in my life to what I've been teaching. But a lot of it was also doing this research, and before long, as the memory and the euphoria of that initial experience faded, it was what I was beginning to lean on exclusively. It was incredibly exciting to see these arguments against the church and learn how to dismantle them. I felt justified in my beliefs, and it all made me want to dive deeper. Bennett made several references to other scholars throughout his response, and I became so curious about them. The two that he quoted or referenced the most were ancient scholar Hugh Nibley, who will get his own episode later, and Richard Bushman, a historian who's famous for his landmark biography of Joseph Smith, Rough Stone Rolling. I knew as I was reading this document that this could be my next area of study. I brought it up to my parents after a little while and discovered that my dad actually had a copy of the book that he agreed to send me. I was elated. For those of you unaware, Rough Stone Rolling was the gold standard of Joseph Smith's life. It was an incredibly well-researched biography that focused on the prophet in a way that I had never before read. By the time the book came, I'd gone through Saints Volume 1, so I had a little bit more of an idea about the life of Joseph Smith in all of its color, but Rough Stone Rolling was on a whole different level. Bennett praised it throughout his faithful reply for its handling of sensitive issues in an objective way while still being written from a believing perspective, and frequently quoted it in the sections of the CES letter that dealt with church history, like polygamy, the Book of Abraham, or the translation of the Book of Mormon. In my mind, it was a perfect next step in my learning, so I began reading it, excited to see what else Bushman might have to say. But something that surprised me deeply happened while I was reading, and it proved to be a completion of the cycle of my testimony. Bushman had a chapter dedicated to the translation of the Book of Mormon and its historical merit. He outlined several arguments for and against the book in a very compelling way, but in the middle of that, almost offhandedly, was a couple of sentences dedicated to one argument that had gone completely unaddressed in the CES letter, and one that I had never heard before, Deutero-Isaiah. I will again keep this brief because the emphasis of this episode is what this experience did for me and helped teach me, rather than diving into a pretty complicated topic. But to keep it simple, a long-standing theory of many biblical scholars is that the book of Isaiah, as it is currently constructed, is a collection of multiple authors' writings from different time periods, not just the teachings of the single prophet Isaiah. Evidence that is used includes drastic differences in vocabulary, tone, emphasis, and subject matter between the first and second half of the book. While it is not a consensus by any means, there is a lot of scholarship on the book of Isaiah that makes an incredibly compelling argument. The argument has a direct impact on the Book of Mormon's historicity because sections of Isaiah that are theorized to have been written well after Nephi took the brass plates from Jerusalem are included in the Book of Mormon and are presented as scripture the Nephites had access to and even directly quote from. Obviously, if these parts of Isaiah were written after the Nephites left, like the theory claims, then the Nephites would not have had those scriptures in the brass plates. So why are they included in the Book of Mormon verbatim? Here's the thing. Rough Stone Rolling addresses this as a concern that people have, but only very briefly. And more importantly, Bushman did not provide any counter-argument to this claim in its brief reference. This seems extremely minor. A massive book filled with controversial topics about a very controversial figure in church history, and the moment in reading that entire book that stood out to me was an offhanded reference to an argument attacking the historicity of the Book of Mormon in a throwaway list. This was what was sticking in my head and bringing doubts back in full force. My reaction was not nearly proportional to what I actually read. So what was going on? Looking back, here is what I can say happened. I had built up in my head that there was almost nothing left in anti-Mormon arguments after the CES letter and the faithful reply. I really thought in my excitement and inexperience that it covered everything. The faithful reply itself may have left some ambiguity on how exactly to cover polygamy or race in the priesthood or the less black and white topics, but I really didn't see that there was anything left for me to be concerned about, especially when it came to the historical factual arguments. Anything that wasn't brought up in the CES letter, in my mind, couldn't have been that important. Furthermore, the CES letter itself was exposed to me in light of the faithful reply as being filled with such weak arguments and shoddy scholarship that I really thought I had it all figured out. I thought for a legitimate amount of time that I could forge a testimony so simply off of logic and evidence. But what Rough-Stone Rolling did was shatter that illusion. I saw for the first time that there was so much more to the broader debate about our religion that I didn't know about. And in seeing that, it helped me come to my senses. As I got further into my mission, I discovered the work of LDS scholars in answering the questions around Deutero-Isaiah, and they were sound arguments, but this whole experience did something far more important than introduce me to the broader, more complex world of LDS apologetics. It taught me exactly what I was missing throughout this whole endeavor. There would always be perfectly legitimate arguments on either side of the Mormonism debate. Incredibly smart people argue both for and against the church. Many LDS scholars have done extensive research and still defend their faith valiantly, while many other scholars research our religion and come away convinced that our faith could never survive real, unbiased scrutiny. There is always more learning that needs to be done. Trying to prove the existence of God or the truthfulness of the claims of our religion by evidence alone is entirely fruitless. In spite of my best efforts and hopes, God needed to remind me that I would never know everything, least of all as a missionary barely out of high school with extremely limited access to scholarly work. But I was so desperate to gain a testimony, to find acceptance, to find a justification, that I took what I saw was the easy way out and tried to build my spiritual foundation on logical grounds. Immediately I was shown just how unstable a foundation of the knowledge of man would be. My faith felt shaken, and the doubts and voices that were plaguing me came back. I went back to fighting them, and I wasn't always very successful. My knowledge had increased dramatically. I got a very big taste of both sides of the debate, and in the end, instead of solidifying me, I ended up right back where I had started as soon as any opposition appeared. In my quest for knowledge and a testimony, I had missed the message God had been trying to communicate with me this entire time. I firmly believe God gave me this experience to nod me off of this fruitless path and begin to turn me down the path of actual spiritual growth. I want to end today by highlighting what I had been glossing over throughout this early period of intense focus on gaining encyclopedic knowledge, and a specific example of this is in the faithful reply. At the end of this massive document that I had read several times over, Jim Bennett ends on an incredibly heartwarming note of why he ultimately believes, quote, "On the whole, it, or the church, makes bad people good and good people better. More importantly, this church is also transformative because people have had a genuine, powerful experience with Jesus Christ, often through the Book of Mormon. I have seen firsthand what the power of Christ can do, and I have encountered God in this church in an intimate, personal, and undeniable way. I don't think those kind of spiritual experiences require me to abandon reasoning or stop asking questions, but they keep me from panicking the next time I hear an accusation against Joseph Smith or the church that I've never heard before. I have found God in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I wrote this with the hope that, despite your best efforts, others find him here too." Bennett ends the faithful reply not on his most convincing argument or one final jab at the arguments of the CES letter. He ends on a testimony. He ends on the experiences he has seen that have helped him come to know for himself about Jesus Christ and the Book of Mormon. This was his foundation. This was his rock. Everything else was purely supplemental. And every other LDS scholar was trying to tell me the exact same thing. Scholarship was great, and it's important to be educated, but substituting actual foundational experiences with God, where you exercise your faith and do the things that He is asking you to do with scholarship, will only leave you empty and unstable. It only took one brief mention of an argument without an immediate counter to completely throw me off of my perceived spiritual foundation. I was trying to build a testimony without its essential components, and I paid the price almost immediately. This cycle of highs and lows continued throughout my mission, but this initial realization helped me recognize the futility of what I was trying to do. There is no substitute to personal, intimate moments with our Creator, and experiencing the atonement and the gospel of Jesus Christ for ourselves. At the end of the day, it wasn't the studying I did that showed me who God was. It was the gospel that I learned how to live, and the relationship with God that it opened up. These personal experiences got me here today. And now I can say that while yes, there is a lot of studying that I have done, and there are a lot of convincing arguments in favor of the church, that is not why I have stayed. I have stayed because I have received a spiritual confirmation that God lives and loves me, and no amount of studying or apologetic work could ever replicate that. Faithful LDS scholars know it, and after trying both ways, I know it, and I am all the more grateful for what I have learned. I testify that these things are true, and I do so in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
This has been an Avi Studios original production.